come all to a beautiful show. It's gonna be awesome and some other stuff. Dee-dee-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee. Some other musical stuff.
Hello, this is special session for the week ending Friday, December 6th, 2024. I'm Brian Schott, managing editor of Utah Political Watch. On this week's show, we will run down the top political news stories in Utah from the past week. My guest on the show this week is Mike Madrid. He is the author of the fantastic book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. We're going to talk to him about the Latino vote, the 2024 election, and some of the things we can expect when Donald Trump takes office in January. Plus, Senator Mitt Romney is riding off into the political sunset. I'm going to tell you a story about Senator Romney, some pancakes, and a fight over a $2 cup of coffee. Remember to subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts, and if you leave a rating or review, it will help more people find the program. You can also sign up for my newsletter for free. The website is Utah Political Watch, all one word, utahpoliticalwatch.news. And if you want to support my work covering Utah politics, you can become a paying subscriber as well. Now, let's tackle the news. During the 2024 election season, there were a series of really nasty mailers that went out attacking Democrats for voting against a number of bills that targeted the rights of transgender people here in Utah. That included the bathroom bill that was passed by lawmakers in this last legislative session that said people had to use restrooms in public buildings that corresponded to the gender they were assigned at birth, and bills that had bans on transgender athletes in women's sports, and also a ban on gender-affirming care for transgender youth in the state. These mailers and text messages came from a political action committee calling itself the Preserving Utah Values PAC. We didn't know much about this group. They did register as a political action committee with the state, but they didn't disclose any spending. They said they spent nothing prior to the election, and that doesn't make any sense because they sent out all of these mailers and text messages attacking Democrats. Well, we found out this week who one of the funders is, and it's House Speaker Mike Schultz. He made a $120,000 donation to this political action committee at the end of November. Democrats here in the state were shocked to find out that Schultz is one of the funders of this group. In fact, he's the only donor to this group. He's the only person who's made a donation that's been disclosed as I'm recording this. And Democrats in the legislature were shocked to find out that Speaker Schultz was the one, or is the only funder behind this group that sent out those really nasty attack ads during the 2024 election. I spoke with House Minority Leader Angela Romero, and she was really taken aback when she found out that it was Schultz who made this donation. Schultz has really leaned in hard on anti-transgender messaging in recent months. If you'll remember, last month, Governor Cox, Senate President Stewart Adams essentially ordered Utah State University to get involved in a lawsuit against the Mountain West Conference because another school, San Jose State University, allegedly had a transgender player on its roster. When I reached out to Schultz about this, I got a statement back where he said, "Defending Utah values is the right thing to do. These principles are the foundation of who we are, and I will always fight to protect them." Schultz did not get much of a return on his investment. If you look at the election results, of the 17 Democrats that were targeted by the Political Action Committee, only 2 of them lost their re-election bids in 2024, and really only one of them counts. That's Democrat Rosemary Lesser. She lost to Republican Jill Coford in House District 10 by just 309 votes. So it's possible that these ads, these mailers and text messages attacking her over the transgender issue could have helped tip the scale scales in Coford's direction. The other Democrat who was targeted by these ads, that is Representative Joel Briscoe, he lost his primary election, and that was before this PAC even got involved in the race. Now, because this Political Action Committee has not reported any spending, even though they did spend on the election, the Salt Lake Tribune reported that a number of complaints had been forwarded to the Lieutenant Governor's office for violating campaign laws. But there's something even more insidious at work here. If you go to their website, it says that it's paid for by the Preserving Utah Values Fund, not the Political Action Committee. And that fund was incorporated as a business in Delaware in late October. And it's important to note that it was incorporated as a business. It's not a 501c3. It's not a 501c4, those nonprofits where they would have to disclose donors. Now, it was Schultz who donated to the PAC, but we're never going to find out who donated to the fund because it's incorporated as a business. And so when you want to talk about dark money, that is 100% dark money. It appears that this group, along with House Speaker Mike Schultz, is really playing fast and loose with Utah's already lax campaign finance laws, and it sets a really troubling precedent going forward. Governor Spencer Cox unveiled his budget recommendations for the next year this week. Here's something you need to understand about the governor's budget. It really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It's the legislature who sets the budget. It used to be that the legislature completely ignored the governor's budget recommendations. There were times during the Leavitt administration that the legislature just disregarded anything that the governor sent forward. These days, the budget process is more collaborative. Gary Herbert and now Spencer Cox try to work with legislative leaders to try and come up with something that both sides can agree with. But in the end, it's the legislature setting the budget, and they don't have to listen to what the governor has to say. There is one budgetary item that it seems both the legislature and the governor are on the same page about, and you need to pay attention to this, and that is that lawmakers are going to be coming after higher education in the state of Utah. Deseret News reports that when Cox was laying out his budget proposal to them, he said that he is, quote, very supportive of the legislature having a heavier hand in deciding what courses colleges provide and shaping alternative post-secondary pathways to fit a shifting economy. His quote was, "I'm one who does believe that higher ed has lost their way across the country in very important ways. They've forgotten their core mission and become much more in the advocacy business than the seekers of truth." Another story in the Salt Lake Tribune this week said that leadership at the University of Utah, they are expecting that there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on higher education, especially the University of Utah, and not just in terms of the budget. You remember there was the legislative audit that came out last month that said colleges need to consider getting rid of courses that don't attract a lot of students or don't do much to prepare students for the workforce. And this is on the heels of the anti-DEI measures that were passed by the legislature in 2024. It's clear that higher education is going to be targeted in this session. The drumbeat has already started. You saw it in Governor Cox's budget recommendations, and it's going to get louder as we go through the 2025 session, which begins in January. And you're seeing this in a lot of states with Republican-controlled governments. They are worried about activism on college campuses, and they're really trying to crack down on that. And that's what you're going to see as the legislature gets back to work next year in their 45-day session, which begins in January. Speaking of the budget, Utah lawmakers may have a budgetary problem on their hands in the next session. They are staring at a budget deficit between $225 million and $700 million. Under the Constitution here in Utah, income taxes from individuals and businesses can only be used to pay for certain things in the budget. And those are public education, higher education, and some social services. According to legislative budget experts, revenues from those those two sources over the first 4 months of the current fiscal year are way below projections. When lawmakers set the budget earlier this year in February, they expected individual income tax revenues to increase by about 2.9% during the coming year. But in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, they've actually dropped 1.6%, which is almost 4% lower than what they had projected. In real numbers, that means that individual income tax collections are between $146 million and $576 million below what they thought they were going to be. And corporate income taxes are even further off of what they projected them to be. Lawmakers did expect that the corporate income tax collections would drop by about 4% this year. In reality, over the first 4 months of the year, they've dropped more than 15%. And again, in real numbers, that's somewhere between $80 million and $135 million. And that's where you get the $225 million to $700 million deficit. And if these numbers continue, they've got a big problem on their hands as they set the budget. Legislative leaders are going to meet on December 9th, that's Monday, to finalize the pre-legislative session budget matters, and that's where they'll also set the framework for education funding next year. Lawmakers have cut income taxes by more than $600 million over the past 3 years, reducing the future revenues that could go towards education and social services by that amount. Those income taxes are already taken into account when they set the projections, the revenue projections for the coming year. So they were already expecting those revenue projections to be down. For them to be trending below those projections, that's a big problem. And you have to start asking the question, did they get too aggressive when they cut income taxes? If these trends continue, then lawmakers are going to have a hard time finding extra money for things that they want to do. They're already talking about expanding the Utah Fits All Scholarship, the private school vouchers program. That comes out of this funding. House Speaker Mike Schultz says he wants to create more technical education programs in Utah's high schools. That comes out of this funding. And if they're staring a deficit in the face, they're going to have a really hard time finding that. Plus, there are also rumblings that they want to do more tax relief. And if they're trending $225 million to $700 million below projections, it's going to get really tight when they go to set the budget next year. Now, we did face this situation last year. Right before the 2024 session, income tax collections were about $130 million below what lawmakers thought they were going to be. But those numbers turned around in time when they had got the final revenue projections for the year in February, so they didn't have any problems setting the budget. And so they're hopeful that we'll see the same thing next year. Pay attention to this issue. This is a big one, and we haven't had deficits in a long time. We do have some rainy day funds. There's more than $1 billion in the state's rainy day fund. So I wouldn't expect any drastic cuts, but this is going to really impact what they're able to do in expanding education programs if these things don't turn around. Let's rewind to the 2022 election. Senator Mike Lee is running for re-election. He's getting a really strong challenge from independent candidate Evan McMullin. And during the campaign, a video from his first run for office in 2010 resurfaces where Mike Lee says that his goal is to phase out Social Security and pull it up from the roots and get rid of it.
I'm here right now to tell you one thing that you probably haven't ever heard from a politician. It will be my objective to phase out Social Security, to pull it up by the roots and get rid of it. Here, buddy.
When that video resurfaced, Lee said his comments were taken out of context and critical details were left out when he was voicing that opinion in 2010. He said that he really meant that the federal government should not have sweeping power over people's livelihoods. And he said that Congress uses Social Security as a slush fund and that Congress has a responsibility to honor the commitments it made to Americans who paid into Social Security. It turns out those comments comments weren't lacking context because in a long social media thread this week, Lee laid out a blueprint for dismantling Social Security and that he is ready to make good on his promise to pull it out by the roots. In that thread, Lee called Social Security a classic bait and switch and an outdated, mismanaged system. And he made several arguments in that thread. He said that Social Security is a tax that the government can use for whatever reason it wants. He said that the money goes into a big pool, the Social Security Trust Fund, and that the government routinely raids this fund for other purposes. And then the point of the whole thread is that the government mismanages the fund, according to Lee, and that Americans would get a much better return if they decided where to invest. What Lee is advocating for here is privatizing Social Security. That idea has been rattling around in conservative circles for years. If you'll remember, President George W. Bush pushed that really hard in 2005, and it didn't go anywhere because it turns out people like their Social Security. About 21% of the federal budget goes to Social Security. That's $1.4 trillion every year. And a report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities says that Social Security has reduced poverty in every state, and it's lifted more people above the poverty line than any other program in American history. So it's a very important social safety net. But what Lee is doing here is he's laying out a blueprint for dismantling the program. And if you don't think that that is one of the goals of the Trump administration, you're not paying attention, because less than half an hour after Lee posted his thread, Elon Musk, who is in charge of the figurehead Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, because he has a junior high sense of humor, well, Musk amplified Lee's post by saying, "Interesting." So it's clear that an overhaul, dismantling, reform, whatever you want to call it, of Social Security, it is on the table in the new Trump administration. The left-leaning group, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, said that Lee was attempting to, quote, undermine public faith in Social Security so conservatives can cut or privatize it. You think? That group pointed out that Lee's arguments about Social Security were either misleading or a complete disregarding of the facts. As to Lee's claim that the government raids the Social Security Trust Fund, they said that it's a bogus claim, that opponents of Social Security often dredge up. The Social Security Trust Fund, which currently has about $2.8 trillion in it, is invested in treasury bonds, which are backed by the U.S. government, and Congress can spend the money from those bonds however they see fit. It's no different than bonds held by Wall Street or mutual funds or foreign governments, but Congress is not able to raid the Social Security Trust Fund itself, and they've never done that. What they've done is they've spent the money that the trust fund has invested into the government bonds. That's where they get that money from, but the actual trust fund itself, Congress does not raid for its own purposes. And as for Lee's argument that people would be better off if they chose where to spend the money, they say that it's true that investments can sometimes pay off, but Social Security is not an investment fund. It is a collective fund. It's a social insurance program that pays out benefits, and it's been around for 90 years, and it's never missed a payment to beneficiaries. But despite all that, this is something that is pushed by Senator Mike Lee, and it's in service of his long-stated goal to pull Social Security out by the roots and get rid of it. He laid out what he wants to do this week, so keep your eye on that as we move forward over the next 4 years of the second Trump administration. The right-wing group Utah Parents United has a couple of big items on their to-do list for the next legislative session. They want lawmakers to crack down on the Utah Education Association, which is the state's largest Teachers Union, and they want to get fluoride out of the state's drinking water. This week, Corinne Johnson, who is the president and founder of the group, was speaking to another right-wing organization, Utah Citizens for the Constitution. She said that among their legislative priorities this year are those two items. They want to crack down on the UEA, and they want to remove fluoride from the drinking water. Let's talk about the UEA first. Utah Parents United came to prominence during the COVID pandemic. They led a lot of the pushback about the mask mandates in schools. I think you'll remember they had a campaign called Let Me See Your Smile, because they didn't want masks covered up kids' faces. And they also wanted to get kids back in the classrooms. They didn't like a lot of the remote learning that went into effect during the COVID pandemic. And they were also a driving force behind the Utah Fits All Scholarship, which is the state's private school voucher program that lets parents take money that's supposed to go to public schools and use it for private school tuition or to pay for homeschooling or any number of other expenses. The Utah Education Association has sued to block the Utah Fits All Scholarship from going into effect, saying that it's an unconstitutional program because Utah's constitution guarantees funding for public education, and lawmakers are taking money away from that to fund these private school and homeschool vouchers. So it makes some sense that UPU would be going after UEA. There are some anti-union bills that they are advocating for. What they want to do is they want to prevent the UEA from collecting union dues from their members through paycheck deductions, and they also want to make the union have to recertify themselves with a vote every year or every couple of years, and if they fail that vote, then the union is disbanded. Lawmakers tried to do that during the 2024 session, but they backed off after the state's unions members had a big show of force. There was massive opposition, and they backed away from that. But UPU wants them to take another run at it this year. The other thing that is on their to-do list is a bill to remove fluoride from the state's drinking water. Johnson said during the meeting that they already have a lawmaker lined up to run the legislation. She wouldn't say who it is, but this legislation is going to come out during the 2025 session. Now, it's already illegal to put fluoride in the drinking water here in the state because in 1976, the voters approved a ballot initiative that said you cannot put fluoride in the state's drinking water unless there is a public vote approving it. Brigham City was the first city in the state to have fluoridated drinking water. Voters there approved it in 1966, and they seemed to like it because there was an initiative on the ballot in Brigham City in 2023 asking whether fluoride should be removed from the drinking water system, and it got crushed. Statewide, about 45% of Utahns have fluoride in their drinking water. That ranks the state 44th out of 50, so they're near the bottom. Nationwide, about 63% of Americans have fluoride in their drinking water. Fluoride has been a bugaboo, especially on the far right in American politics, for a number of years. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were conspiracy theories about it being part of a communist mind control plot. In more recent years, there have been concerns that it may negatively impact health of people who have it in their drinking water. Now, what you're going to see is Utah Parents United saying that there is a massive number of parents who want these things, who want lawmakers to pass these bills attacking the UEA and getting rid of fluoride in their drinking water. One of the ways that they show that is the results of their legislative priorities survey that they send out to parents, asking a number of questions, and then they present these numbers to lawmakers. And this year on their survey, one of the things they ask is, would you like to see fluoride removed from the water in the state? And there were several questions on the survey attacking the Utah Education Association. I looked at some of them. One said, do you believe the UEA represents your values? And another said, do you believe the UEA has a negative influence on education in the state, and then they asked whether they would support getting rid of these special privileges for the UEA, such as payroll deduction for dues, and then requiring them to recertify with a vote. And so you'll see Utah Parents United go up to the Hill with these survey results, and they will loudly proclaim to lawmakers that 85, 95, 100% of parents support this idea. But it's not a scientific survey. If you're not on their email list, if you're not in their social media channels, you're not going to see this survey at all. So it is a self-selecting echo chamber of people who already support what they want to do. This is a group that is hostile to the idea of public education. They are big advocates of homeschooling and parental choice in schools. So they are very hostile to public education. They have a vested interest in presenting these ideas as having overwhelming support by parents in the state, when really it's just a small group of people who agree with them already. Watch how this group, Utah Parents United, which has a lot of sway on the Hill, presents these issues, saying that parents want this. Well, parents who responded to their survey want this. It's not a scientific survey. It's not an accurate depiction of what the overall opinion of the group of parents in the state is. It's just those who responded to their survey, and the large number of those already agree with them in the first place. They're not big organizations. There's not a lot of people who are part of these groups or who support these groups, but those that do are very engaged and they are very organized. And that's why they have so much pull on the Hill. And you need to understand that, because they are the ones who are driving a lot of the decisions that your government is making right now. So pay attention to that as we move forward in the 2025 session. Joining me now on the show is Mike Madrid. He is a longtime political strategist. He was the political director for the California Republican Party for a number of years. He's the author of the tremendous book, The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. And I'm really excited he had some time to join us today. Mike, how are you?
Brian, I'm doing great. It's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk about what happened in the 2024 election. It seemed like towards the end that Kamala Harris had some momentum, but polls leading up to the election kept telling us it was going to be a very close election, and that's what happened. We had a very close election, and everything broke towards Donald Trump. Why do you think that happened?
I think fundamentally, when we look back at the race, I think people just were not happy with the direction of the country and the performance of the administration. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing that goes beyond that, teeth gnashing about, the future of democracy and racism and sexism. And I don't mean to diminish all of that, but when we're looking at margins this small, and this was a historically close election, very close, both in the popular and electoral college, what you saw was a 1.5% break in one direction. It could have broken just as easily in the other direction. But what we know from campaigns is that when there are large swaths of undecided voters, they tend to break away from the party in power. Because if you haven't closed the deal within 4 years, the chances of doing that in the last 7 to 14 days is pretty small. So I think this really just followed that trajectory. This was, there was a rightward shift in a lot of places, but they were not so significant that they, I think, portend a whole lot more than people were not comfortable with the performance of the last administration from an economic perspective, and it probably wasn't a whole lot more than that.
Did that surprise you that things broke towards Trump? He had been in office before, but it seems like voters viewed him as a change agent, and that's why a lot of the undecided voters broke his way, even though he had been in office before. That's a really interesting, I guess, idea that Donald Trump, who had been the president for 4 years, was seen as the change candidate.
Yeah, that's not terribly uncommon. I think, surprised, no. Disappointed, I think, is probably a better word, because people knew what they were largely getting. And I think this is just a reminder to most people who closely follow politics that, the closer you follow politics, the more intricate you are in understanding the nuances of the different perspectives of both parties. It's lower information voters, people that are not as consumed by the obsession of politics that so many of us are, that really don't know who Matt Gaetz is. They don't really know what, Trump said at the last rally. They don't particularly care. They don't particularly know. They don't take a lot of this terribly seriously. And they are the ones who broke strongly for Donald Trump, not because they're concerned about democracy one way or the other, but because they are concerned about the economic performance of each administration. And they remember better times under Donald Trump.
Yeah, and you mentioned that people were dissatisfied with the direction of the country, and I agree with you. I think that that's the thing that doomed Harris in this campaign. People are now trying to use people in Donald Trump's orbit, his allies, are now trying to paint this very close election that was based on the economy as a mandate for radical change in government, overhauling the government. You have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy doing their pretend government agency that's going to look at cuts and things. And you're just hearing all these plans for a radical reshaping of the American government. I'm curious your thoughts about trying to paint it in that direction. I understand why, because if you control the narrative, that this was historically that this was a landslide election when it wasn't. If you control that narrative, you're able to plant that narrative, then it's easier to do what you want to do. But I'm trying to figure out your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm of the opinion that Donald Trump would be doing this even if he lost. Right? Remember, if Donald Trump lost right now, we would be in the middle of a civil war with his supporters taking to the streets armed and saying this election was overthrown again. Unless they win, then they're going to throw a heated tantrum and would claim a mandate regardless. So look, Donald Trump, if Donald Trump was the only person voting for himself, would be claiming a mandate. So I'm not particularly concerned about that. They're going to do what they're going to do with the levers of power they have. And so it's up to the opposition party and members who are opposed to it in a democracy as it stands to be just as vigilant in pushing back and arguing that this is not the direction they want to go. And that's fully legitimate in the system that we have. In fact, it's required in the system that we have. So no, there's no mandate. I think that's a very overused word, but I think we have to remember who we're talking about here. These are folks that are going to claim it regardless.
Your book, which came out right before the election, was incredibly prescient, in which you argued that neither party was effectively communicating to this very large block of voters, Latinos, many of whom grew up in America. They are not immigrants. They are disconnected from the immigrant experience. And whichever party is able to figure out how to effectively engage those voters and speak to those voters was going to have success down the line. And what we saw is that Donald Trump, even though he was talking about mass deportations and has called, Hispanic immigrants rapists, and they're not sending their best, and there was that terrible joke at his pre-election rally about Puerto Rico. Despite all of that, 43% of Latinos voted for Trump in this election. What's your take on that? I mean, it basically is proof of concept of your book.
Yeah, and again, I did not necessarily write my book as a prediction, although it proved to be one. I wrote it as a warning, right, to the Democrats. So they'll be like, you better pay attention to what's happening here. And unfortunately, a lot of that was either unheeded or culturally not able to get there. But I think it's still a good roadmap going forward. So to your question, we have to really understand that just the very nature of equating this huge swath of Americans, now the largest ethnic minority in the country and rapidly increasing, equating this group with the immigrant experience itself, even when it gets to talking about mass deportations or building a wall or sending their own countries, is in many ways its own ethnic trope. It's its own offensive categorization. To ask, like, how can you be bothered by that when we don't ask, that same questions of white Europeans about European politics is the point I think people really need to grasp. It is absolutely okay and appropriate to talk about border security in the way that I think Kamala Harris did, for example. That's not racist. Trump is doing it in a racist way. I think we can all agree on that. But the point is, Trump is viewed as a much more strident protector of the borders, whatever that means, which was ultimately what he was aiming for. And I'm not certainly not excusing him, I'm trying to explain it. And when you have second, third, and now a discernible fourth generation Latino voter that doesn't have any personal experience with the immigrant experience, to have them equating this talk, this language, these policy suppositions any differently than the average white American really should not surprise us. What should surprise us is, again, our continual need to say, why aren't you reacting as an immigrant would see the world? That, I think, has turned off a lot of Latinos. And it's that unrelatability that I think is particularly damaging to the Democratic Party at this moment in time.
One of the things that we're seeing now in the aftermath of Trump's win is just a ramping up of the rhetoric and the amplification of the plans for these mass deportations that are coming. But there's also this curious phenomenon that is happening where you're seeing in media reports and in interviews and in social media a number of Latinos who may have immigrated here or may have families who are undocumented here in the United States. And their thought is, it's not going to affect me. They're only going to get the criminals. They're only going to come after those who are breaking the law, ignoring the fact that being here illegally is breaking the law. But I think that goes to one of the central points in your book is that a lot of Latinos are disconnected from that immigrant experience. And, you know, you've seen a lot of this on social media where people are saying it's F-A-F-O, F around and find out. I think a lot of people are going to be really shocked when we get to the find out stage of this, meaning that you're going to see people who didn't think they would be targeted by some of these policies, finding that their families are being rounded up and put and deported.
Yeah. Let me say maybe, and I'm not suggesting. First of all, and I've written extensively on this on my Substack too. If there are these mass deportations, which by the way we have done twice before in our history, we did it during Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Right, Hoover actually began the process. As the Great Depression began, we rounded up what was called the Mexican repatriation, which is a sane-washing way of basically saying we removed 1.8 million Mexicans, half of which, by the way, over half of which were U.S. citizens. Rounded them up from California, deported them, even though they were U.S. citizens. And we did it again under the very racist term Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower administration when the Bracero program was started. Again, over half of the people rounded up and deported were U.S. citizens. So we have a bad history of this in the first place. I think what the difference here is, and we will see, if this does happen, if there are camps set up and millions of people are rounded up, I do believe that there will be very, very significant pushback broadly, not just with Latinos. I also think, by the way, there will be very strong support for the program in the Latino community as well. And we should examine that. But, and here's where it gets really important, the main reason why I'm not terribly sold on the idea, I wouldn't be shocked if he did it, but I wouldn't be shocked if he didn't do it, is because of the extraordinary economic impact that this is going to have on most of his rich friends, who are going to say there's absolutely no way you can destroy our supply chains or destroy the agricultural economy. This is incredibly inflationary, and we're reliant on this labor stream. In fact, we need more labor, not less. So I think the jury's really out as to whether or not this will happen. Now, do I believe that he will begin deporting people based off of a certain criteria? 100% I do. Is he going to start with the most violent offenders amongst us? Absolutely he will. And I will tell you what, if Democrats start to oppose that, they're going to hit the find out stage really, really quickly because the American public has zero tolerance for that. If you are here illegally and you've committed crimes and you are being rounded up by the Trump administration, Trump's numbers are going to go through the roof, especially if Democrats start opposing it. So we got to be really careful. And like I said, we need to be vigilant. And I don't know what the plans are, but I do know that we have never successfully done this as a country without including U.S. citizens. I also know that this would have a massive, massive impact on our businesses and our economic interests, many of whom are very close to Donald Trump. And that's distinctly different than what we were experiencing when we did it for the first time in the 1930s and the second time in the 1950s, when agribusiness and, by the way, and the Mexican government were both complicit in both of those mass deportation movements because they needed the cheap labor too. So we're going to have to wait and see. Like I said, would I put it past Trump? Of course not. Would I be shocked if he did or didn't do it? I wouldn't be either way, but I would also caution people to remember this guy promised to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. He did neither of those things. And so when Latinos look at this guy and say, yeah, he's doing this tough talk thing that he does, the cowboy talk, but he never really does it, there is some rational basis for it.
You've seen some people in the incoming administration, Stephen Miller in particular, start talking about ending birthright citizenship, about denaturalization. That seems, that's a terrifying thought, that they would strip citizenship from people who were born here and birthright citizenship came out of the post-Civil War era, but that's a terrifying idea. Again, I think there's a lot of risks in doing that, and I agree with you. There would be a lot of pushback. Do you think that is going to happen, or do you think it's just rhetoric that's going to quickly run into reality?
That's a great question. And look, I think that there is no doubt that there's going to be a very heated discussion about repealing the constitutional amendment that guarantees birthright citizenship. And I've heard this in my entire 30 years of working in Republican politics. In fact, it was one of the main issues that I heard Republicans talking about in 1992, right? Is saying we need to revoke this relic of the Reconstruction era. Birthright citizenship was put in the Constitution to protect the children of slaves. That's why it was there, is what they were basically arguing was you weren't a citizen if you were a slave. So to protect their children, we automatically granted citizenship to anybody born on this soil. There's a different consideration than what we're seeing right now. I believe very strenuously we should continue birthright citizenship. I think it brings up a lot of interesting questions. So, for example, if you're a combination between a recent migrant and somebody who's been here for 2 or 3 generations, and that child is born here, what does that mean? Talking to you, Barron Trump, right? Like your mother's an immigrant. What does that mean? What does that mean, right? What are we talking about here? And so we need to be very careful. But I changing the Constitution to get there is another consideration. Now, what that means legally as it works through the legal system, I do believe the Trump administration is going to advance a lot of these issues to challenge some of these notions. But unless you repeal the constitutional amendment for birthright citizenship, it's very, very explicit on what that means, which is regardless of the intent of the amendment, if you are born on this soil, you are a U.S. citizen.
Well, we all know that there's no way that they're going to be able to repeal an amendment, but one of the things that the Trump administration is talking about, and I've seen multiple reports on this, is they're going to try to do it administratively. One of the things that they've said is they were refused to issue documents like social security numbers or birth certificates to the children of immigrants who are here illegally. And that's a way to administratively accomplish something that they're not going to be able to do through the mechanisms provided in the Constitution. So there's a lot of ways that they could try to go about this, and once it gets to the Supreme Court, who knows how they would rule on this sort of thing. To me, it still seems like something that we need to be aware of and worrying about, because if they can administratively do these things, then that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting this isn't a very, very, very serious concern. It absolutely is. Even if they weren't doing it administratively, just the sentiment that somehow they could do it is deeply troubling. Unfortunately, we're kind of way past that at this point in American history. But I do believe the courts, as conservative as they are, if you ruled against something like that, which is very explicit in the Constitution, you're basically saying the Constitution doesn't exist anymore. Are we at that point? I don't think that we are. If we are, then will be another conversation. That doesn't diminish the seriousness of the question. It is. This is a very deeply concerning issue and question. I think it's actually a legitimate conversation to have and understanding why we as Americans, as a unique nation, as a unique country, have birthright citizenship and should, and I would argue, should continue it. But there's no doubt there's a wide swath of people. If you polled, by the way, if you polled birthright citizenship, it is not popular. People want to get rid of it. Now, as that becomes more real and as human story starts to be told and people begin to understand the nuances and the complications and the history, that changes. But he's not on shaky ground in the court of public opinion on this. He would be shaky in the court of the law, the legal system. But again, we know that that's not anything he's afraid of taking on.
He is Mike Madrid, his book, and if you haven't gotten it, you should go buy it, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. Mike, where is your Substack? I'm also a subscriber to that. I'm sorry I didn't mention in the open, but people should also subscribe to that. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And again, I write about these topics almost daily as we're kind of barreling down into this new era and this new age. My Substack is called The Great Transformation. With Mike Madrid, talk about everything from the changing concepts of race, gender, currency. I'll be doing some stuff on Bitcoin with Bitcoin hitting $100,000, what that means in our changing institutions. A big part of what I talk about, Brian, you and I have these conversations offline too, is this country is changing. Whether Kamala Harris won or Donald Trump won, our institutions need some dramatic transformation. We have to change the way we think as Americans going forward. I'm certainly not happy with where we're at this moment politically, but I am optimistic. I do believe that we are headed towards better times, even though the road to get there is going to be very perilous.
He called what was going to happen in the 2024 election. He's been right on pretty much everything that he predicted that was going to happen leading up to this moment. So there's absolutely no reason why you should not buy his book and subscribe to his Substack. Mike Madrid, thank you so much.
Brian, always love being with you. Love the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Senator Mitt Romney said goodbye to the U.S. Senate this week. He delivered his farewell address. And because of that, I'm going to tell you a little story about Senator Romney that involves some pancakes and a fight over a $2 cup of coffee. In January of 2018, Senator Orrin Hatch announced that he would not run for another term in office. And up to that point, there was tons of speculation that Romney was going to jump into the race to succeed him. And he finally made it official about a month later in February of 2018, announcing that he would run for that seat, which made him the odds-on favorite. As you can guess, everybody in the Utah media was clamoring to sit down and interview Romney. So in early March, his campaign set up a series of interviews with local media outlets. We would go one by one and sit down and talk with him. We'd each get about 15, 20 minutes, and they were going to be held at the Little America coffee shop downtown. So on the day of the interview, we all showed up and waited our turn in the lobby area of the hotel. And when my turn came, one of his campaign staffers came and got me and escorted me towards the back of the restaurant. And we turned a corner, and Mitt was sitting with his wife, Ann, and he was absolutely housing a plate of pancakes, just putting these bad boys down. Mitt apologized for eating during our meeting time, but he'd been at this for a couple of hours already, hadn't had breakfast yet. I said it was absolutely no problem, and I ordered a cup of coffee to have while he finished his breakfast. And then Mitt started to expound on his love of pancakes for several minutes. It was amazing. He said that they were one of his favorite breakfasts, but nobody made them quite as good as his wife Ann could, and he just went on and on and on about pancakes. It was absolutely delightful and also kind of surreal, because here was a guy who just 6 years before that was the Republican nominee for President of the United States, and he's going on and on and on about pancakes. Sometimes we forget that politicians are people too. They have lives away from the political arena like the rest of us. They have families, they have hobbies, and some of them really, really love pancakes. After we finished our interview time, I asked the waitress for my check for my coffee, but Romney said it was already covered. He'd already paid for it. Now, this may sound like a brag, but my personal ethics as a journalist dictate that I do not take free stuff from anybody that I'm covering. I don't take free tickets to events. I don't let someone else buy me lunch. I buy my own coffee. The problem was Romney had already paid the bill, which included my cup of coffee. I didn't have any cash on me at the time. And you might be saying to yourself, well, it's just a $2 cup of coffee. Why didn't you let it go? I can't. I was a journalist. I don't want to owe anybody anything, even if it's just a $2 cup of coffee. So what happened was one of his campaign staffers and I had to go to the front of the restaurant and reverse Romney's bill, take my $2 cup of coffee off of it, recharge Romney's card, and then I paid my bill for the $2 cup of coffee. And yes, I gave a pretty generous tip because I knew that I was causing a problem and some frustration over just a $2 cup of coffee. I've covered Mitt Romney on and off since he headed up the 2002 Winter Games in Salt Lake City, and I'm going to miss him. He's always been gracious with his time. I've enjoyed our interactions over the years, however brief they have been. He's always been forthcoming. You may not agree with his politics, but the sense that I got is that he took his public service job seriously. He wanted to do things. He wanted to get things accomplished that he felt would help people, that he felt would make a difference. And he did that while he was in the Senate. He found a sweet spot where he could work with people on the other side of the aisle and passed a number of really significant pieces of legislation during his one term in Washington. I wish him well as he retires from public life. And I think one of the things that he's looking forward to is he won't have to deal with reporters like me anymore. Godspeed, Senator Romney, and thank you. And that's all for this week. My thanks again to Mike Madrid for joining me on the show. His book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy, is a great read. I cannot recommend it high enough. His Substack is The Great Transformation with Mike Madrid. Buy his book, subscribe where you can. He is a very smart person and worth your attention and will help you understand some of the things that are happening in our current political moment. Remember to rate and review this podcast to help new listeners find the show. I would be very appreciative of you if you did that. If there's a topic you'd like me to tackle or a guest you want to hear on the program, reach out and let me know. You can email me or find me on Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram. Those links are in the show notes. Sign up for my newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news. You can sign up for free, or you can become a paying subscriber, which supports my work and allows me to continue committing acts of journalism covering Utah politics. I'd be very appreciative if you are able to swing that. It's as little as $5 a month to become a paying subscriber. It makes more podcasts like this possible and more reporting on Utah politics. Special Session with Brian Schott is written and produced by me, Brian Schott. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.